Sveiki, Melns uz Balta klausītāji! Šī epizode mums būs nedaudz citādāk, varbūt kā jūs esat ierasti, jo mēs atrodamies Rīgas StratCom Dialogue konferencē, šeit tepat Rīgā. Taču šo epizodi mēs ierakstīsim angļu valodā, jo mēs ņemam šo iespēju un esam uzaicinājuši vairākus starptautiskus ekspertus, lai parunātu ar mums par dezinformāciju un informācijas manipulācijām tādā plašākā pasaules kontekstā. Jo mēs, protams, esam pieraduši runāt no Latvijas perspektīvas ar Latvijas ekspertiem. Tāpēc gaidiet tālāk, mums būs intervijas ar vairākiem ekspertiem, gan no Eiropas, kā arī no Amerikas. So the first guest for our special episode today is Greiems Brukijs, who's coming all the way from Washington, D.C. in the United States, where he is the Atlantic Council's Vice President for the Technology Programs and Strategy, as well as the Senior Director of the Digital Forensic Research Lab. Glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be back in Riga.
All right, so as you mentioned before in conversation, you've been here quite a few times here in Riga. So our listeners know where your expertise is coming from, could you tell briefly about your job, what is your line of work, and how is it related to what we do on our podcast?
So at the Atlantic Council, my job is to oversee all of our technology programs, which includes a number of things, including a geotech center focused on artificial intelligence and emerging technologies, a cyber statecraft initiative focused on hard cyber infrastructure, as well as the thing that I helped start and build at the Atlantic Council, which is the Digital Forensic Research Lab and the Democracy in Tech Initiative. And the Digital Forensic Research Lab has been partnered with NATO StratCom Center of Excellence since 2018. And what we are is a team of open source researchers that are looking at open sources of information across the information environment to understand what is verifiable or how narratives develop or how those who would try to manipulate the information environment are doing so. Whether that's state threat actors or whether that's grifters or people that are just doing it for the laughs. And so we navigate the information environment and try to understand it. And then the Democracy and Tech Initiative is a big tech policy shop that focuses on things like internet governance to make sure that the open internet, which we are all engaging on and trying to understand what's going on, is secure, open, interoperable, and remains free. So that's what I run at the Atlantic Council. And before I was at the Atlantic Council, I was an advisor for strategic communications at the White House National Security Council. So this is an ecosystem that I've been operating in and working in for a long time, both from civil society and from kind of an expert academic level, as well as from a practitioner level in government.
Thank you. It's great to have such a well-seasoned expert here on our podcast. I will ask you maybe also your government side of expertise later on, but you mentioned that you overview the information environment on a broader sense, and our podcast listeners are used to a very Latvian perspective because we usually have Latvian perspectives and experts. So, and you're coming so far away from the US, maybe you could elaborate on your line of work, what you see currently as the most urgent or dangerous information threat that you're dealing with. So what keeps you up at night in this sense?
So there's a lot of things that are outright threats or outright vulnerabilities that are taking us as a collective society away from a shared set of facts that democracy depends on. And that's the basic premise. But for me, if there's a number of threats like what state actors like Russia are doing in the information environment, or how an adversary like China is getting more aggressive with state-backed operations to influence publics towards kind of their worldview, all of those things drastically matter. But from my perspective, one of the most fundamental threats that we face is a retrenchment from transparency and thus accountability in online spaces. For all of the groups, whether they're in government or whether they are in industry or whether they are from civil society like the DFR Lab, it is becoming harder to understand the information environment because there is less transparency. And so if we're talking about all of these threats, in order to understand them, we have to have basic access and transparency. And that is for a number of reasons, including industry retrenchment, including regulatory frameworks that are diverging, right? If the US is doing something different from the EU, that creates space for less transparency. And thus, all of these other big threats that we're talking about will be less understood. And to me, that's the most important thing in this moment, and is making it really, really hard to understand all of the threats that we face.
Yeah, thank you. I think also having a less transparent environment is something very threatening to governments. And as you mentioned, your line of work has also been in the government. So have you noticed if democratic governments, so say in the US, say in the Western Europe, have changed their approach to how they combat and guard information and go against disinformation? And has there been a turning point? Is it the war in Ukraine, or is it something else in the past couple of years?
And so for me, the three trends about the information environment that kind of shape how we look at the information environment right now. Number one is, and these are very obvious, and so bear with me, but as a collective whole, they start to frame how we do our work. Number one, internet usage for news consumption, and more importantly, community, is going up. And so people are looking more towards online platforms for news and for connection with other people. Number one. Number two, the information environment of platforms across the internet is more fragmented than we've ever seen. There was a moment in, let's say, 2018, the very first time I was at this conference, where there were a number of mainstream platforms, and that's where we focused a lot of our attention. And now it's an ecosystem of platforms that are totally divergent, increasingly on ideological lines, especially in places like the United States. And globally, right? Telegram, for instance, is something that is secondhand and very obvious in Riga. In the United States, almost nobody uses Telegram. The user base is much less, but it is still a drastically important global platform. And so the information environment itself, or the platform environment, is more fragmented. So as usage is going up, the space is becoming more fragmented. And then within that, trust in nearly every single institution is going down. And not just democratic institutions, trust in places where we have traditionally had a lot of trust, like our employer, right? Like you ask your employer for information about your calendar throughout the year. Trust in every single one of these social institutions that we engage with on a day-to-day basis, statistically, is going down, ranging from day-to-day life to like civic life. So especially trust in democratic institutions is going down across the board. And so all three of those things converge. And then you have this overlay of how technology is changing all of those factors and making them slightly more difficult to navigate. And so if that is the basic outlook, as a strategic communicator in government, you have to do two things. Number one, not assume that people are going to trust you inherently. You don't have that inherent credibility because you have some fancy job in government. You have to earn that continuously. And then the other thing is that at this conference, we're a bunch of experts. We work in government, we're expert in the things that we do. And sometimes that lends itself to not actually strategically communicating because we get so caught up in the jargon of what we do, or kind of assuming that people are going to know what we're talking about. And so we really, really have to be able to connect with people where they are. And this might sound ridiculously obvious, but talk like normal people when we're talking to people. Right? If you get up onto a stage or in a public announcement or a public engagement and you sound like a robot, then you're not going to instill a huge amount of trust in what you're saying. So being able to connect with people where they're at and connect with people as normal human beings is why podcasts are doing so well right now, because we're having basically a normal conversation like we would in a coffee shop or something like that. And strategic communicators have to keep that in mind at all times when they're engaging wherever they are.
Yeah, thank you. So then my last question is going to be building on that. So you mentioned how sometimes strategic communicators fail to have that kind of relatedness to ordinary people. So maybe from the ordinary people sense, have you seen if there's any kind of myths or kind of misunderstandings when it comes to strategic communications or combating disinformation campaigns?
You know, I think not necessarily misunderstanding, but a attention deficit, right? Like, think about your day-to-day life. You wake up, you're gonna have breakfast, you're gonna go to work, you have a bunch of errands that you probably have to do, some of like family obligations, some of which are a lot of fun and meaningful, some of which are tedious. You know, there's a lot going on in everybody's day-to-day life. And so, as a strategic communicator, sometimes the thing that you're strategically communicating about, that's the thing that you're focused on, but you can't assume that that's going to be the first priority for everybody when they have a really, really busy life going on. And so figuring out how to be able to engage with who I would call high intelligence but low engagement audiences or general publics is the difference between being successful in trustworthy and effective communications or not.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed the rest of your time here in Riga.
Thank you.
The second guest for our podcast today is Valērija Kovtuna, which is a strategic partnerships lead at Open Minds, which is a firm that provides threat intelligence and response services to over 30 governments and organizations. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So to start off, so our listeners understand your line of expertise, could you tell us briefly about your line of work, what you do at Open Minds?
So at Open Minds, we combine technology and human expertise, especially localized expertise, to understand the effects of, we call it authoritarian influences, you can call it disinformation, propaganda. I think the terms might vary, but if you say in more overarching terms, that would be authoritarian influences inside of Europe, generally in Western democracies, as well as understanding how authoritarian regimes work, what's happening inside of the information environments, and what we could be preparing for when it comes to potential threats coming from authoritarian states.
Thank you. So then, elaborating on those potential threats, is there a specific maybe tool or actor or a tech trend that you think deserves more attention right now that could potentially develop in maybe the next year or the few years that we should be more focusing on right now?
You mean as a threat, a specific threat?
As a specific threat.
Well, we advocate for the idea that it's not enough to just focus inwards, understand what's happening inside of Europe, keep monitoring, understanding, analyzing Russian propaganda. That's what we've been doing for years now, and I think every single organization that has something to do with communications in one way or another dedicates resources to analyze influence campaigns. But if we are always in the position of protecting ourselves, we are like a boxer on a ring who gets punched but doesn't punch back. So our stance is that we need to also invest resources and energy into understanding how our adversary works, what's happening inside of their country, what the people are talking about in there. Because I keep referencing the same situation that I faced back then when I was in Ukraine running a national media literacy program, Filter. I was looking into Russian information environment a few months before the full-scale invasion, and I was shocked because it seemed like the war had been happening already there. It was normalized, the way they were calling Ukrainian Nazis, how hostile their information environment was getting towards Ukraine, how many justifications were there towards actually, invading Ukraine and making it a part of Russian Empire. That was enormous, and I was shocked that these things were happening. And when I reached out to some of the senior officials in Ukraine asking, are we doing something about it? The response was, well, why would we do something inside of Russia? This is just them dealing with their own information environment. Let's focus on how we can make our people more media literate. But denying this aggression coming from the neighbor, denying the fact that they were already preparing their domestic audiences for the potential war, we actually didn't do ourselves a favor, because then these information threats crossed the border and they became physical. And now we have an irreversible loss, which is coming from actually having people being killed on the front lines and in peaceful cities because of Russian attacks. So what we are saying now to European countries, in particular those that are in physical proximity to Russia, it's not enough to just, obviously, it's important. You should keep doing the job that we are doing, advocating for media literacy, educating societies, making them understand how disinformation works. But we also need to do something to make sure that Russia cannot attack us informationally as much as they do now.
Yeah, so as you already mentioned, Ukraine was one of the countries that already had information threats coming from Russia way before what we see right now. It's kind of spread all over Western Europe, and even as mentioned in one of the speeches here today was that even UK considers itself to be at war with Russia. One of the reasons is because of these large information campaigns. And considering that Ukraine has had it for a longer time, maybe there are some key lessons that you would additionally say to the Western countries, for instance, when it comes to how to build like a narrative resilience, how to build public trust, which is an important thing.
One of the interesting observations that I had goes beyond media literacy. It's something about identity and meaning. And what I do, I have my own experiment where I ask people of my age, millennials, Gen Z, slightly older, more or less 25, 35 years old, what would they do if the war happened in their country? The first reaction is I'd fly away, I'd get tickets to go to the US, I'd find a way to avoid the bloodshed, the cruelty, and obviously no one says that I'll consider defending European values and I would take a gun and protect my family. Everyone thinks there is a way to flee. Whereas in Ukraine, we were also a bit unclear about who we are, where we come from. We obviously were oversaturated with Russian mass media culture in our information environment. But when the war happened, suddenly everyone was thinking, well, I'm distinct, I'm Ukrainian, and that's the identity that I want to defend. And suddenly there was a huge spike of interest in our history, in our different paths from the Soviet Union, from the Russian Empire. Everyone was excited about the idea of why it's cool to be Ukrainian and why it's worth resisting Russian occupation. Same in Europe. I think what Europe needs to do more is to invest in alternative message that would be as strong or even stronger as Russian propaganda messages. Because what Russian propaganda does, it advocates for traditional values, traditional family, Orthodox Church, anti-LGBTQ, everything that you can tangibly feel here and now that affects your daily life. What democracy offers in response is freedom of speech, democratic values. How do you feel it? What is it that affects your daily life? So I think we need to think more about what meaning we provide, how do we build this stronger connection to the identity, and what we can do in order to, even if we continue doing media literacy, how do we persuade people that it's really an important, necessary thing that is affecting their daily life? And I think that's the job that needs to be done in more volume.
Yeah, so building on that last point, we already heard here in the conference today that sometimes there is a gap between the elites and the ordinary people, and sometimes the strategic communications or the narrative campaigns we want to do as democracies don't really go to those people. And this might be a bit of a hard question, but do you have maybe any insights on how to do this strategic communications effectively so our ordinary people understand and it's not just something that's perceived as elite and not understandable?
Yeah, so when we were running in Ukraine, this media literacy project, one of the things we realized is you need to go out there and talk to people and listen to them, and you have to do it always. It's not just a one-time situation. You talked and you decided that you're going to build the whole campaign on it. Moods change. It's a dynamic environment. So sometimes people might be, you might identify female audiences 35 plus who have kids and who are thinking about their future, and for them it's a priority. So how do you integrate media literacy training into that desire, human basic desire to make sure their kids are safe? So finding a way to connect it to their daily needs debates is important. And what I've been thinking recently, as someone who's been exposed to art in multiple shapes and forms, I figured this is the best way to connect with people. It might not be an obvious media literacy course or an obvious training on how to detect disinformation, but if it's a story that catches you, it walks with you after you go out of that performance place. You go do your daily routine and it sticks with you on an emotional level. And then if you have that connection on emotional level where people tend to associate something with positivity, it's much easier to, continue nudging them, continue educating them. So I think we need to be more creative and find ways that resonate with people on an emotional level. And that's not a unique view because Russian propaganda has been doing it for decades. Take into account all the TV shows that they produced where there was nothing obvious, but in fact in between there were some geopolitical messages. Tarot reading, TikTok where they talk about future telling. You can see a future teller, a young girl who pretends to know how our future would look like, who's gonna be someone's boyfriend, and then in between she would talk about some dark forces coming after Germany, meaning that it's NATO forces telling Germany what to do. It's very simple, but at the same time it's ubiquitous. It works. So I think we need to look into the emotional side of things more often as well.
All right, thank you so much for spending your time with us. I think it was very useful for our listeners because we, as coming from Latvia, we are also years and years experience of being exposed to Russian disinformation. So it's great to hear from Ukraine, which is also in the same case. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
So our next guest is Hanna Šelesta, who is the Director of Security Studies at the Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism, and is the Editor-in-Chief at Ukraine Analytica, which is the first Ukrainian academic journal in English, and as well is a non-resident fellow, a senior fellow at a Center for European Policy Analysis, which is located in Washington, D.C. So great to have you here.
Thank you for the invitation.
So just so our listeners understand your line of work and your line of expertise coming here today, could you just briefly describe your work? I know it's in multiple fields, but yeah.
My primary is definitely the national international security with the emphasis on the conflicts and malign foreign influence, hybrid warfare. But it's happened that in addition to this, I've always been involved a lot with the Global South, or the Global Partnership for Ukraine. So that's why I've been looking widely to not only foreign policy of Ukraine, but in general for the world affairs. And since November, I also have a privilege to be head of the supervisory board of the Ukrainian Institute. It is like the biggest governmental institution, but doing with the public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy. So now for me, it's quite unique to look how culture and security are interconnected, especially in times of war.
Yeah, thank you. So as you mentioned, a lot of your work is connected to Ukraine, and I'm guessing that's when you get a lot of invitations to events because of this expertise. So my question is, what are some maybe key lessons that we can see from Ukraine when it comes to building public trust and kind of a narrative resilience, as we know there's a lot coming from Russia?
Definitely. Unfortunately, we have too many years, if not decades and centuries of this work. And that is one very important lesson that all of us can learn, doesn't matter in which country we are. Even if you build the trust, even if you build the narrative, it doesn't mean that it is stable and forever and that it would not be challenged by your adversary. So what we reached in 2014 doesn't mean that Russia is not trying to do it again against us. It doesn't mean that they are not constantly challenging, for example, the narrative that the European Union, the NATO countries are our allies, that they are supporting us, and that Ukraine should be supported. So that is narrative number, like the lesson number one, that it is the sphere where you need to work constantly. You cannot allow yourself to relax till the very last moment of the war or of the conflict. Lesson number two is that usually your adversary is not creating something new. They're fighting the vulnerabilities inside of your societies, and in case these vulnerabilities are not addressed, not just as the level of the public policy, that's one thing, but are left in the information vacuum. It's not enough information inside of the country. It is exactly that place, that pool where the adversary influence would come, because they're taking the space that is not covered by the reliable domestic actors. First of all, domestic actors, for sure. Lesson number 3 is very easy. The government cannot do it alone. It always should be the cooperation in the triangle of journalists, civil society, and the governmental structures, because none of these 3 have enough capacity and capabilities and tools to cover during the war of the scope, especially what Russia can do. But let's be honest, now we have China, Iran, we have other actors who are doing absolutely the same. So they are learning as well as we are learning. And maybe the lesson number 4, we need to understand that adversaries are usually working in at least 2 dimensions. They're working domestically for your country, and they are working internationally against you. So a lot of the narratives in the current information societies are perfectly coming through the borders. Doesn't matter what languages are, because all of us are reading international media. So publish one article in the best US, for example, media outlet, it would be translated to many, many other languages. So you need to analyze, to monitor, and to follow not only the domestic discourse, but also what is said about you and who are the proxies of your adversaries abroad.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And you mentioned already that there's a growing amount of factors. You mentioned China and Iran. So maybe, is there a specific actor or a tool that is being used in information campaigns that is, for you, seems very concerning and something that we should pay attention to in the next 12 months? So maybe what keeps you up at night currently?
When you speak about such actors as North Korea or Iran, we see more of the cyber operations. Not yet, they don't have resources for the information operations. But with China, we see quite a significant involvement in many European countries since COVID. So it's not because of the war. This cooperation of the Russian and Chinese started much early in the information sphere. What we definitely need to follow, it is the understanding that one of the main tasks is to undermine the unity. That value that for the last 60 years we've been proud of, EU and NATO, for these countries like Russia and China is easier to deal with individual countries than when we are united. So what they definitely would be targeting, it is European Union unity. It is this idea of the Brussels as some superiority who is dictating you. They would emphasize the sovereignty, but doing the negative to this. And also they are utilizing their what they consider as the weakness, what we consider as the strengths. Mm-hmm. Plurality, freedom of speech, democracy, we consider it as our strengths, but they know how to manipulate with this, because they know that we would be afraid to limit and to cut some of the information sources. So probably we need to be very careful how they would blend inside of our information sphere, creating local proxy website, channels, groups, all other instruments, pretending that they are from the European countries, that it is not adversary.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so we're here in this conference with a lot of experts on strategic communication, but that can be something that maybe is not so known to maybe ordinary people. So I want to ask you, maybe, do you think there's any kind of common myth or misunderstanding when it comes to, say, to an ordinary person about what is strategic communications, what is combating disinformation?
First of all, I would definitely divide the combating disinformation with the strategic communication, but one bridge that can be made. Combating disinformation is easy. You identify what is false or fake or misinformed, and you're just explaining it. What the 10 years of Ukrainian experience demonstrated, that originally you can do it, but it's impossible. It's like a virus. You cannot just combat all cases. If you are not building your own narrative, it means the new is coming. So the best sometimes to fight, it is to create your own narratives that would be stronger. The aim of strategic communications is exactly to build these narratives. It is the creating the communication. It's not a propaganda. It's not the media campaigns. It is much wider, because if it is the good strategic communications, it's not just to make people to believe in something, it makes people to be part of creating this story. And that is what is important in the democratic societies, when each citizen would feel the ownership, why they are responsible for their passwords, why they are responsible for what they are commenting, what they are sharing in the social networks. It's not something what just the disinformation laboratories can teach you. That is what strategic communications also need to bring to the people when they would become the storytellers of the information security of their own societies.
Thank you. And then lastly, you talked a lot about narrative building and how it is very important and it can be also deconstructed and we kind of have to react to that. So maybe you have kind of one key takeaway or lesson when it comes to maybe EU as a whole. You mentioned that it's important for us to have a unionized narrative. So how do we build that narrative so it is not being attacked and attacked and then ordinary people are in a kind of confused space?
It's always would be attacked, so to this we should be ready. We must be ready, I would say. But the issue is that if you are not doing this job, that would be even easier for your adversaries. So there is no vaccines for the disinformation, and there is no one solution. And here probably would be one of the biggest mistakes of the current strategic communication sometimes, that if they decided that one narrative was successful in the country X, they're doing absolutely the same in the country Y. So I would say that if we would like to be successful in European countries, we need to understand that it should be individual stories, it should be local, not just global. It should be with the idea that united we're strong, but we appreciate the differences. That's what is united Europe. Yeah, it's not one country. It is the appraisal of all this diversity that we have over here. That's why we are so rich morally, in this. And with this, that's probably one of the recommendations for the future, if we would like to be successful, not to undermine the individual capacities, not to undermine the small nations, thinking that they know less, for example, they have less capacities, but to find out who is stronger in which and unite these efforts in one big, wonderful cocktail of ideas.
Yeah, I think talking about small nations, I think in Eastern Europe, it has been shown how small countries can be experts when it comes to cyber attacks like Estonia and disinformation campaigns on a broader sense. That is it from us. Thank you so much for coming here today.
Thank you.
So our next guest today is Anneli Portmane, who is the Senior Specialist at the Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, so just so our listeners understand your line of work, could you briefly elaborate on what type of research you do? What is your line of expertise? Yeah.
The Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare is concerned with, obviously, health and welfare of citizens. So therefore, the prevention of extremism or violent radicalization that I'm involved in looks at welfare-related things rather than security-related things. So my stance would be, in order to have security and safety, you need to have well-being. And so therefore, the research I do is partially directed towards professionals. What sort of extremism do they encounter in their work? What do they think they would want to do about it? Or what would they need to know? And on the other hand, I'm very interested in preventive factors. So what is it that helps people from not radicalizing? Saying no to extremist lure.
All right, thank you. And so in our podcast, we usually talk about misinformation, disinformation, and information manipulation, which is also connected to extremist groups and radicalization, because usually it's the same groups that spread these kinds of campaigns. So maybe in trying to connect these two, in your line of research, is there maybe a specific actor or a specific tool that you are concerned about when it comes to disinformation, and maybe then connecting that with extremist groups that you have maybe connected in your line of research that is what is something that we should be looking at in the next year or in the next couple of years and paying attention to?
I think one of the main problems is the way algorithms strengthen what is already there. So if I'm in search for, say I'm a 13-year-old person in search for meaning of life or in search for whatever, all of a sudden the algorithm in itself, whether it is on TikTok, wherever I happen to go, will start to feed certain kind of information towards me. So we've had cases where you have a perfectly, ordinary teenager just kind of like boredly scrolling here and there on the internet, and before you know, there are all kinds of messages that kind of narrow your focus of interest and start to feed you with absolute misinformation, or trying to kind of steer you towards the sites where then you could possibly be recruited. So we see this online dimension being used for purposes where, much the same way we used to go fishing, you have a little bait and you draw the fish in, so do the same via algorithms. And so that's something where I think that in order to do something about this, we need a wide variety, kind of a whole society approach.
Yeah, thank you. And also, Finland is right next to Russia, is bordering with Russia, just as we are in Latvia. And I think that already entails that there's a lot of lessons to learn when it comes to combating and keeping a safe society and having our welfare checks. So as you do in your institute, the Caring for Welfare. So maybe there are some lessons that you have learned throughout these years that maybe then could be applied to other European countries, say in Western Europe, that are now starting to kind of see this threat coming from Russia or coming from radicalized groups even.
I think one of the important things is who tells your story. So if there is a story to be told, like a national story or a story of your community or story of how to tackle grievances, if you do not control that story and tell it from a healthy perspective, somebody else will. So for instance, a lot of extremism stems from the feeling of having been wronged. So you have grievances, which are legitimate. Maybe your people group has been treated badly, maybe something has happened. But then the next question is, how do you tell the story and how do you tell about the remedies to that grievance? And I think there it is vitally important to underline messages that promote health and well-being. Because even though something would have been done to me or to the group I belong to, then the question is, how do I deal with it so that it brings more health and more well-being? Because we know that mere retaliation, resorting to violence, will harm the perpetrator and the victims. So how do you deal with these grievances? And so I think one of the things we are trying to do is we're trying to foster dialogue, much like what we have here now, so that you have places where you can air your grievances, your opinions, for instance, on a community level or on a city sector level, or in whatever level that you need to air it out. Are we doing a perfect job? No. But I think that is something, the fostering of dialogue, that we have become very aware of, because at the same time, like I was talking about the algorithms, we are very aware of the polarizing pull, so that each little group discusses only with like-minded and feels the other ones are enemies. And so we're trying to dismantle this so that there would be true dialogue.
Thank you. Then building on that, you mentioned about telling your story and how that is something we should use as democratic societies, but it's also something that these radicalized groups do. So I want maybe to ask you to maybe expand on how you maybe notice how, for instance, radicalized or extremist groups use this and tell their story to lure people in, because obviously it is an extreme group, and a lot of times it comes also with these people having to perform some kind of extreme action. So how do they show that narrative? How do they tell the story to kind of loop people in?
I think one of the examples is, for instance, distrust towards authorities. So there have been active campaigns from state actors trying to discredit especially child welfare services, and to either portray them as an entity that is only interested in immigrants from a certain background or refugees and taking those children away. So we've seen, for instance, a malicious campaign in Sweden, which resulted in all kinds of protests and things, and similar incidents in Finland, where the state actors fostered narratives that were saying, for instance, child protection services take away Muslim kids, put them in Christian families, or sell them to institutes that will then act as foster care, but it's all, very bad and just targeting the Muslim minorities. Now, none of this is true. This is a blatant lie. And it has been debunked time and time again. But if you have grievances, then you might believe this story. So, we need to tell the story, of both factual stories, but we also need to tell, why this is not true, so that we can appeal to the same emotional pull that these stories have. And so there, I think that, for instance, in Finland and in other democracies as well, we have this long tradition of wanting to include everybody, of kind of underlining, no, we are in this together, so that there is space for people to come. They're also one of the things that have been the conspiracies or that have been spreading is the mere idea that Finns are, of one type. But it's absolutely not true. There's never ever been a time that all Finns would have only spoken Finnish. We're a bilingual country. We've always had Swedish minority. There's never ever been a time when we would all look the same. So we need to tell these stories of belonging and of togetherness in order to counteract that very emotional story of look how they're treating you, or all Finns should be blonde and blue-eyed. Well, we're not. So we need to kind of be actively telling emotionally compelling stories to counteract these other stories that the extremist groups, aided by state actors, are telling.
Yeah, thank you. I think a good example of how all Finns are not the same, don't speak the same language, is Eurovision, where the Swedish representatives were actually from Finland. We're just from a Swedish
Exactly.
minority.
There you go. Bara bara bastu.
Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
We're very proud of them.
I think this is a very interesting line of research that you do, and just so maybe for listeners, you could maybe mention where, if we're interested in learning more about this kind of research, so maybe something you publish, what do we search up?
Well, you will have to wait for a while, because we are right now doing a research to canvass all of Finland from a professional point of view. What have you seen of extremism? Where is it? What does it look like? What could you do to help? What would you want to know more about? We've just launched this survey. And so half of it is ready, and we published some of the results or had a seminar about them. But the real publication of the real results will be next year, when we will also go to education professionals and ask them the same questions. What have you seen? Where have you seen it? What do you think we should do? Because it's one thing to try to kind of map extremism from a security point of view, but it's actually another one to try to map it in such a way that how do you tackle it on real life, real people, well-being level, which is done in schools, in social services, in health services. So that discussion and those results are kind of like hold that place, and in a year's time you will know more.
All right, thank you so much for coming here today.
Thank you for having me.
So our last guest for today is Eto Buziašvili, who is a research associate at Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab based in Washington, D.C. Glad you could join us here today.
My pleasure to be here.
So we already talked with Graham about the line of work you do at the research lab, but maybe so or listeners know, so what is your line of research and what do you focus on?
My focus is Russian-originated information operations and foreign interference that targets Eastern Europe broadly. And in Eastern Europe, we mean countries starting from Georgia, continued with Ukraine, Moldova, Baltics, of course, Poland, etc. So it's like a broader Russia's attempts to interfere in Eastern Europe, and what are the tactics and techniques that Russian actors are using to interfere in the digital engagement space.
Okay, thank you. And so from other guests on this podcast, we heard that maybe sometimes we're not looking enough about how we're portrayed outside of our own information space. So in terms of, for instance, how Russia is portraying, for instance, the EU or countries like Georgia inside. So from your line of research, have you maybe had any revelations about how it's being done internally, or is it something that we definitely should look at more?
Yeah, I think that we should be looking at more, because there are these discussions if information operations really matter and if they are really making a real impact. And I would say that impact is something that is felt in a long-term perspective. You cannot have, one post which will impact a voter and which will go and vote for a far-right group or a pro-Russian candidate. This is a long-time game, and the impact is long time. Therefore, I think that we should be taking information threats more seriously, not neglecting different kinds of operations and putting them together in the puzzle. Of course, Russia and other state adversaries, as well as non-state actors, they are not only continuing, but they are doubling down on information operations. The operations are becoming more complex, sophisticated, they are more persistent. One of the latest researches that we have looked at is Russia's Pravda network. This is one of the Russian information operations, which has proved that Russia aims to be more persistent rather than reaching different audiences. It means that we're talking about many, many years of changing minds of many people. Therefore, we shouldn't be asking a question about is there any impact, but what will be the impact?
Thank you. And then moving to now the external side. So we've seen that now disinformation campaigns coming from Russia have expanded all over Europe. And it used to be just maybe more focused on Eastern Europe. Exactly. So maybe coming also, you yourself from Eastern Europe, from Georgia, have you maybe seen maybe some kind of key takeaways we can take from these countries that in terms of how do we rebuild trust in our society, how do we stand with our narratives when it comes to these disinformation campaigns that we should then expand to broader Europe or the United States as well?
I think something that we're lacking on the European continent is proactive communication and proactive communication of the narratives. And basically strategic communications, the theme that we're here today. I think that we're more looking into exposing and debunking rather than communicating our own narratives and reaching as many people as possible. And another thing that we are not doing, but like a couple of Eastern European countries have done, is targeting actors which are engaging in information aggression. And I'm not talking about like state actors. I'm talking about sanctions which should be imposed on companies that are hired by state actors, or some individuals, organizations, etc. So we should be looking into more complex responses and more proactive responses when it comes to responding to information aggressors.
And then within a broader part of your research, maybe there's a certain, this is not just talking about the Russian disinformation campaigns, but more generally, is there any kind of specific actor or tool or technology that's being used that is now worrying you or keeping you up at night about that this is something we should keep attention to in the next couple of years?
I would definitely go with AI generated content, because what we're seeing now is that AI is used by threat actors to not only generate videos and photos, but to generate whole articles and text. And the generation is increasing dramatically. I would expect that in 3-5 years there will be more than 100% doubling when it comes to each reach and scale of information operations. And we're not talking about the scale, we're talking about more audiences, more speed, more platforms, more people. I would say that yes, definitely AI generation would speed up with, many percents the information operations that we're currently seeing today.
And so now building on that AI part, do you see maybe a positive outlook that perhaps AI could be something that we then utilize and use for our benefit of being resilient and keeping a democratic society, or are you more concerned that it's bringing more harm than good?
I would definitely say that there is many great potential in AI when it comes to empowering tools and the tools that are helping organizations as well as international institutions to first expose actors, expose networks, to have the intelligence so that you base your actions and responses to based on that intelligence. So I would say that definitely AI would play more crucial role in future when it comes to our capability of exposing threat actors.
All right, well, that's it from us. Thank you so much for coming here today.
Thank you for having me.
Paldies, ka noklausījāties šo epizodu. Šī bija jau 36. epizode no mūsu Melns uz Balta podkāsta. Šo epizodu, kā arī citas, vari atrast Spotify, Apple podkastos, YouTube, kā arī mūsu mājaslapā www.melnsuzbalta.lv, kur arī atradīs citus pamācošus materiālus, kā piemēram rokas grāmatu pret dezinformāciju. Kā arī neaizmirst mums piesakot sociālajos medijos, mēs esam gan Instagramā, gan Facebook, gan TikTok, tā kā vari atrast mūs jebkur. Un gaidi jau nākamo epizodu.